Reading with your kids.
Hola, ni hao, konnichiwa, assalamu alaikum, shalom, jambo, bienvenidos. Hi, my name is Jedley, and this is the Reading with Your Kids podcast, coming to you from the beautiful neighborhood of Reedville in the southwest corner of Boston, Massachusetts. We are so glad that you're a part of our beautiful Reading with Your Kids family. We hope that you subscribe to the show on the iHeartRadio app, on Podbean, on Spotify, or wherever you find your podcast. We have a wonderful guest returning to the show, Eva Wong Nava, talking to us about her brand new book, Mina's Magic Malong. You know, we've been talking about it for a while. In just a few days, the Reading with Your Kids podcast is going to be at the Chicago Toy and Game Fair on Navy Pier, November 23rd and 24th. It is going to be a fantastic time. The Chicago Toy and Game Fair is the largest toy and game fair in North America. Your kids and you are going to have a chance to meet inventors. They're going to have a chance to meet authors. They're going to have a chance to come to the Reading with Your Kids booth and become part of the Reading with Your Kids podcast. That's right. We'll be inviting folks to preview some of the wonderful books that we've had here on the show. And we're going to invite you to record a short little review. And some of those reviews are going to be used on a future edition of the podcast. I can't wait to be at the fair because I'm going to have a chance to play with life-size toys and games. It's going to be a fantastic time. And check this out. If you use the promo code RWYK, that's the Reading with Your Kids initials, at shytag.com, you'll be able to save $3 off every ticket you purchase. That's the Chicago Toy and Game Fair coming soon, November 23rd and 24th, Navy Pier in Chicago. One of the fantastic books that we are going to be previewing and proudly displaying at the Chicago Toy and Game Fair is God Always Here by our friend Kelly Gretler. This is a really, really touching book. God Always Here touches on the subjects of illness and hospitals and bravery and faith and having a sense of courage and peace through all of it. I mean, let's face it, hospitals can be scary. The loss of control over what's happening around us can be overwhelming at any age. Well, God Always Hears gives the readers a sense not only of what to expect when facing a diagnosis, surgery, or recovery, but also a sense of calm as they navigate through this unfamiliar journey. It's a beautiful book, and the illustrations are absolutely amazing. I can't wait to find out what the folks at the Chicago Toy and Game Fair think about God Always Hears. And I would love to hear what you think about it, too. God Always Hears is available on Amazon. God Always Hears by our friend Kelly Gretler. Joining us right now from Singapore, I am so happy. I'm so happy that she's awake to join us because it's very early in the morning in Singapore. We're happy to welcome back one of our Reading with Your Kids certified great read authors. Please welcome back the author of Mina's Magic Malong, Eva Wong Nava. Eva, so good to speak to you again. How are you?
Hi, Dad. Really good to speak to you. I'm well, thank you. How are you?
I am wonderful. It's a beautiful day. Well, it's a beautiful evening here in Boston, and I'm really excited. I love when we have authors back. I especially love when we have authors back whose books were recognized by our panel of evaluators that to be a certified great read. Eva's book, The Boy Who Talks in Bits and Bobs, is a Reading with Your Kids certified great read. And that's pretty wonderful. You're in good company. We have lots of fantastic books that are on our certified great read Hall of Fame.
Thank you. I'm really excited to be here again, talking about my new book.
Yeah, and I'm excited to hear about this. Please tell us all about Mina's Magic Malong.
So Mina's Magic Malong has really two characters, a little girl named Ella and her nanny, who's called Mina. Mina comes from the southern Philippines. Mina is really her nickname. She is actually called Amina, which in Arabic means honesty. So, and her friends, the backstory of Amina is that her friends call her Mina. So, Mina's the nanny, and she has to go home. back to the southern Philippines because she's now got grandchildren.
Wow. And that's quite common in Asia, where women will come from one part of Asia and travel to Singapore or Beijing or another country to care for other families' kids.
That's right. That's right. So in Singapore, Singapore is known, for me, I call it a nanny state. Okay, there are two meanings to this, but the meaning that I want to talk about is really being a state where most people have home help, and their live-in help, domestic help, and because a lot of women go back to work, and the children or our children are being looked after by domestic helpers. So this story really addresses the child's feelings when that helper has to go home, has to leave. So Ella is finding it difficult to cope. She tries hard and, in her 6-year-old way, to stop Mina from leaving. But Mina has to go because she has to go home to look after her grandchildren. And she's not seen her family in years and years. And the story tells readers about how there's a whimsical take to it, where Mina gives Ella a present, and that present is a Malong, which is the southern Filipino word for sarong. And that sarong helps Ella to keep that bond going. To know that she's never, that Ella that Mina is never far away. So without spoiling it for the readers, basically the book was inspired by a lot of conversations with my own domestic helpers, with other domestic helpers, and with some children who have told me that they're really sad. They're sad that their helper has to go home.
Yeah, that's not the situation that we have here in the United States, although more and more families are bringing in nannies and au pairs from different countries. But as you were talking about the relationship between Mina and Ella, I was reminded for a number of years when my grandmother retired, and my grandmother was my best friend in the world, and she was awesome, and I was very lucky that, I was lucky and unlucky in that I grew up in a neighborhood where most of the people in the neighborhood I was related to. And that was really wonderful because I could walk down, 2 or 3 doors down to visit my grandmother and go a different direction to visit an aunt. It was unlucky in that if I did anything wrong, everybody knew who I was because they were all related to me. And my mother soon found out. But when my grandmother retired, just to keep herself busy, she decided to become a nanny for this young boy that lived in a different part of town. So my grandmother didn't need to go to a different country, but the bond between my grandmother and that little boy that she took care of was so incredibly close. She really loved him, and he really loved her.
Yes, that's right. We all form bonds with the people who we care about, don't we? And even if it's someone, even though it's someone that's not related to us by blood. For example, in this case where, children do form bonds with the people who look after them. They can't help it because, they're being looked after by their nannies really for many, many hours of the day and the week.
And it sounds like that situation remains like in the case of my grandmother. I think my grandmother took care of this kid until he was, like for longer than most kids. I think until he got to high school, just because they just loved each other so much. Is that the case in Asia where you will have a domestic helper for years and years and years?
For some families, I mean, there are families who've had their domestic helper, for 20 years, some even 30 years, and the bond also forms within the adults in the family. Helpers who are long stay helpers, as I call them, become part of the family. And it's also it is very much an Asian thing, I would say, or Asian way of living, I would say, and it has roots in history as well, where often little girls in the past, because of poverty, girls were just sold to households, and they became servants as little girls growing up in these homes. So there's a history to that, and there's also a necessity, I guess, because Singapore is really an expensive city to live in, and not everyone is privileged enough to say or be that stay-at-home mom. And not have home help. Even stay-at-home moms have home help, only because home help is actually rather inexpensive, I would say, in this part of the world, which I don't think is right, because it's just my opinion, where you can have home help here for under 1,000 Singapore dollars a month. They live with you, and they often don't get a room of their own. Let's just say in majority of the cases, and this home help has become such a necessity that no one really questions it, I guess. And it's just when I have a baby, when I get married, I have a baby, I'll just have someone help me, And what it is that I think there is also not enough conversations to help children cope with this loss. It is a loss, because when their nanny has to go home and they've looked after you for years and years and years, it's a loss, because they've got to cope. I mean, the child or the children will then have to cope with saying goodbye to someone they love, they form a bond with. So in writing this book, I was hoping that that it addresses it through a children's picture book, that parents can actually read the book to their children and start these conversations, ask them how they feel, talk about the helper, who is a person and with family of their own. And that they're also mothers who have had to leave their children behind to look after someone else's children.
Yes, and it's interesting as you're speaking about this. I think it's a fantastic book and a fantastic opportunities for families in places like Singapore and other Asian countries to talk about this and to talk about the relationships and to help everybody see the domestic help, and remind them if somehow they've forgotten that person is a human being and is deserving of respect, and that they have a family, and that they've, because of circumstances they're in, and because of the poverty they face at home, that they need to make these choices, and it's very difficult. But I think it's also a wonderful and really important book for kids and families in other parts of the world, because I think the fact that there is such a difference in terms of poverty, and there's some people who are super affluent and some people who are incredibly poor, and the differences between people, and here in the States we're talking about creating a more equitable society. And I think one thing that has to happen in order for a more equitable society to come about is for us to realize the discrepancies and the great discrepancies that exist these days.
That's right. And that the inequalities, I guess, what are privileges against what are not, yeah. I mean, you're right that this situation isn't just prevalent in Singapore or Asia. I mean, everywhere in the world, I guess, or in cities where women have to go to work, where women choose to go to work, and there's nothing wrong with that, at all. When as women, when we go back to work, who looks after our children? There's someone, it's another woman, I suppose, even if it's an au pair, even if it's not someone who is a live-in, someone who comes to you daily, for example. Many of these women have families of their own, have children of their own, and I feel often, they're not being asked about, how your son is, or, how's your, some of the helpers that I've spoken to have also very tragic stories about their own children. I mean, of course, this doesn't go into the book at all. It's a children's book at the end of the day, and it really centers on Ella's emotions as she watches Mina pack her bags, ready to go home. And, and there is that tender moment when Mina gives Ella a Malong, which I said is a sarong. And she carries Ella, she ties Ella into the Malong and carries her, like how some women wear their babies. And this is quite predominant in Asia, where, children are held inside sarongs. I suppose I know that in America there are many women who also hold their babies as part of attachment parenting. And so that Malong, which is an heirloom in her part of the world, in Mina's part of the world, is given to Ella to say, look, we will always have each other.
And that is a beautiful thing. And just by the way, Eva, there are some dads here in America who wear their kids too. I had that baby, I forget what they call it. It's been so long, but I carried my kids in one of those things right in the front, and it was awesome.
Yeah. My husband did that with our children too.
Yeah.
Just carrying our babies.
One of the things, as you were talking, we were really fortunate that my mom was with us when my kids were young. And so when I wasn't able to be home with my kids, when my wife was at work, my mom was helping care for the kids, and that was wonderful. So they didn't do the daycare, and there was no need for them to go to preschool and things like that. I love the description. It's heartbreaking when Ella has to say goodbye to Mina, but the fact that they had that relationship during such an important time in Ella's life is beautiful. Here in the States, when kids are in daycares, it's like they're in school from, the age of 6 months. They're in one classroom for 6 months, and then, when they turn 1, they go into another classroom with a different teacher, and then another class, so they can have 4, 5, 6 caretakers in a daycare, and those daycare workers are wonderful. And like I said, my kids didn't go to them, so I can't, make informed judgments. But it just seems to me that, that bond with that one person would be just so much more beneficial. It's something I would want to choose for my kid, other than, being in a classroom setting from such a young age.
Yes, I guess everyone makes different choices. I mean, when I was living in the United Kingdom in London, I mean, places like people do send their children to daycare, which is really a long day, and it starts from 6 months. I guess you put your baby there and go to work and collect your baby at the end of the day after work. It wasn't a choice that I made. for myself. I was a stay-at-home mom, you know, tightening our belt and, you know, finding ways to cope, financially as well. But I do understand that, you know, some people, who can't afford home help, because in certain places in the world, you know, to have someone to come to your home and be there, not necessarily a live-in, it's expensive.
Mm-hmm.
And, I mean, I'm, without going so much into the socioeconomic, you know, the reasons for why people have
Sure.
help or not have help. I'm just interested in the bonds, you know, that form, between caregivers, any caregivers really. I mean, whether they're children, caregivers to children or caregiver to, you know, geriatrics, you know, it's the bond that forms between, people, that forms between often two people.
And
So that's what I'm interested in when I wrote this book.
And that's a beautiful thing. And one of the things, as you're talking about Mina's Magic Malong, it just reminds us that, you know, blood and ethnicity and nationality and citizenship, that's really secondary to the fact that we're all human beings, that we all have the capacity to love each other and form bonds with each other.
That's right. Absolutely. Absolutely.
And I think this situation that you mentioned with, you know, caregivers taking care of elderly folks in geriatric situations, that might be something I'm facing in a not too distant future. But I mean, that's becoming more and more of a reality. And
yes.
And I really hope that we are open to, you know, relationships, and that we're open to having our caregivers develop strong relationships with the people that they're caring for, whether they're kids or elderly folks or folks with disabilities, folks with special needs. Here, I actually, I don't know if I told this on the podcast one time, but I had a discussion. I was performing at a school, and I mentioned to the kids that, you know, I knew that their teachers cared about them and loved them, and the guidance counselor at that school gets so angry at me because he said we don't love these kids, we're professional, and I thought, oh, how sad.
Yeah.
How very sad that is.
To even admit that. Gosh.
Well, yes, I thought it was kind of brazen for him to admit that, but I think that that's an attitude a lot of folks have, and, you know, professionalism is a wonderful thing, and we want people to be competent and to be professional in their jobs. But you know, when it comes to caring for people, I think that you have to have that love and that bond in there too.
Absolutely. I think, I mean, you know, there are all sorts of love, isn't there? And aren't there? And I think that, you know, if you go into a profession where you have to deal with children, you have to somehow love them or like them maybe, you know. Yeah. And,
you know, one of the things that strikes me is that you, in your writing, whether it's The Boy Who Talks in Bits and Bobs or Mina's Magic Malong, you have this deep fascination with folks who are different and the relationships between people. Where does that fascination come from?
Good question. I guess I write from a very deep space, as most writers do, I guess. And my writing helps me process things that or thoughts or that you know, I find difficult to articulate in other ways. The Boy Who Talks in Bits and Bobs came about you know, with a lot of reasons, you know, personal ones, and also you know, realizing that, you know, some of us who can speak, who have voices, actually maybe don't, and who find it difficult to speak up and speak out. So for the tagline for The Boy Who Talks in Bits and Bobs, the tagline is "Your voice is stronger than you think," and it's really me wanting to empower my readers, empower the children, to tell them that, you can speak up. Even if you can't speak up, you can sing like Owen, and that there are people who will help you. And in The Boy who talks in bits and bobs, it's a teacher who comes out and says, I hear you, I understand you, and I can help you. It's a different formula to the many picture books that are out in the market, where in children's picture books, and if you speak to agents and publishers and editors, they'll say, we want the children, we want the main character to have agency. We want the main character to solve its own problems, or, and so, you will have agents telling you, or publishers, people who are gatekeepers of the industry, saying that, we don't need the parents in here, we don't need the teacher in here, as an example. So I write not to formula. I don't want to, because it's not because I don't think children shouldn't have agency. Yes, it's great if they do, when they do, but often readers of picture books are parents, and the listeners are children, and I would like children to understand that they do have help. They can actually reach out, and not be left alone to think that they have to solve the problems on their own. I don't know if that makes sense.
No, it makes, what you're saying makes perfect sense. What doesn't make sense to me is the idea that we want kids' books where the kids don't need help from adults. Because it's, as I go around to schools, and the issue that folks are most often asking me to address in my school presentations is the issue of bullying. And the biggest challenge that schools face is trying to get kids who are being victimized, or trying to get kids who are witnessing incidents of bullying, to speak up and to say something to an adult. Because kids in those situations usually can't deal with it themselves, and they need help. So it's interesting that what you're hearing from the quote-unquote professionals in the kidlit business, who are creating books for 4, 5, 6, and 7-year-olds. We want them to be able to solve their own problems. And then meanwhile, when those same kids get to be 8, 9, 10, 11 years old, the whole issue is trying to get them to open up and ask for help. So maybe there's a disconnect there. Maybe we should change some things.
It's just my personal opinion. It's in no way, discrediting what agents do and what editors and publishers do. There's a plethora of great books out there with really, spunky main characters who are, who children can relate to. There are many of them. I think I just don't want, I'm just the kind of person, and it's just me, not wanting to follow a formula. And I think that, we don't have to. We write what we know. We write what we want, that we cannot find, I suppose.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's Maya Angelou who actually said this, that if there is a book out there that you can't find, then you must write it yourself. And that was the premise for the books that I've written so far, and the books that I'm going to write, or that being published next year, and in the future.
Well, we're really excited that you're writing those books, and just as we're speaking, and I know that you wrote Mina's Magic Malong for a young audience, for families to read with their really young kids, but I think that this would be a fabulous book for high school kids to sit down and read, because I think it could be the start of some really serious conversations about what's going on in the world and about the humanity and about relationships and about working together to build a more respectful, more equitable world.
Well, thank you for that. I mean, it would be great if high school kids are going to read this picture book. It would be great. I mean, the illustrations are just so lovely. The illustrator is an Indonesian emerging artist. Her name is Novita Eliza. Just want to give credit to her. She read the text and she really, felt for the story and just the illustrations alone. The way she had depicted Ella's face and Mina. When I looked at the proofs of the illustrations, I just teared up.
Yeah.
I teared up. I mean, talking about giving credit, this book was also written with a friend of mine called June Ho. June is a book reviewer, and she and I met. So we're talking about bonds. We're talking about relationships. So she and I met when she came to a launch, one of my book launches, and she reviewed my first debut middle grade book. Which is also a diverse book, a book about difference, with a boy on the autism spectrum. And then we became friends, and, we started conversations about stories, about writing, and it resulted in Mina's Magic Malong. So I really want to give credit to her as well. She's unable to join us for the podcast because she's back in Malaysia at the moment with family. So, so our writing's journey started with Mina's Magic Malong, and we are continuing to write more books that will be launching next year.
That's wonderful. Well, remind everybody where they can connect with you online.
So online, I'm on Instagram at Eva Wong Nava, my website, which is also Eva Wong Nava, and on Twitter at Eva Wong Nava.
All right. We've had the pleasure tonight to have a fascinating conversation with the author of Mina's Magic Malong, brand new book from Eva Wong Nava. Eva, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you, Jed. I really had a great time. Thank you for chatting with me and asking me all these important questions.
Please be sure to join us for the next edition of the Reading with Your Kids podcast. Our guest will be Elizabeth Rage. She'll be here to tell us about Christmas kindness, kids. A great topic as we are approaching the holiday season. That's the next episode of the Reading with Your Kids podcast. I want to thank the folks who made today's show so very wonderful. Of course, we want to thank our friend Eva Wong Nava. Be sure to check out Mina's Magic Malong. Also want to thank our sponsors, Kelly Gretler. Be sure to check out God Always Hears. Also want to thank our folks, our friends over at the Chicago Toy and Game Fair. It's happening this coming weekend, November 23rd and 24th, Navy Pier in Chicago. I want to thank my amazing producer, Fatima Khan, for all she does for the show. I want to thank my beautiful wife for all the support she gives me. And most of all, I want to thank you. Thank you so much for being part of our beautiful Reading with Your Kids family. And thank you so much for taking the time to make the world a better place by reading with your kids. I'll be looking for you in the next edition of the Reading with Your Kids podcast.